Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. My name is Laura Smith, and this is Amy and Paddy. And as I remembered downstairs, the title of the talk today, we're making a collection that lasts examples of disseminating material via digital platforms and building context around recordings after they're made. So, as you can tell from this title, it does mean that we're going to be talking about collections sort of once it's been collected. And now that could sound really kind of backwards in sort of presenting this to you today, because you're thinking of going out and getting on with the field recordings and making this collection. But I assure you it is actually quite important, and it can be actually quite useful to look at what happens to collections in order to help you, become more informed as a collector. So, as I explained downstairs, I am one of the librarians that works at the English Folk Dance and Song Society. So I work with this material pretty much on a daily basis. And so my main concern as a librarian is to make information accessible. Access which includes the preservation and organisation of this material. By doing that, it actually makes it useful. Now, it's interesting at this point then, or important at this point then, to consider, well, if I want to make this useful, who am I making it useful to? And so, for you to examine who your potential users are, it can really help you be informed as a collector, to know what kind of material that you're going to be looking for, and how you can go about collecting that material. So, if I'm thinking who are our users, and what are they actually going to be interested in? So from my own experience of working in the library and people coming in and asking questions about the material that we have, I've found that they actually do come from quite a broad, or there's quite a range of backgrounds there. So, for example, you do have your professional singers and musicians. Now, this is the obvious one. You're going out, you're part of the Song Collectors Collective, you want to go out and collect songs. So that's going to probably be quite the bulk of the material that you're going out to collect. But also then we do have the academics and folk song academics and folklorists. Now, this was kind of touched on this morning, because this is where it becomes interesting in terms of, well, what kind of songs are you collecting? Now, this can get a bit tricky as well in terms of you could start asking, well, what is a folk song? What is the definition of a folk song? Who are traditional singers? Now, I don't think we're going to have time to go into that discussion this morning, because these are questions that people are asking all the time and still debating. So, but then it does make us think, well, what kind of songs are we going to collect? Is it going to be those known folk songs, those ones which have been collected in the past by the Victorian collectors, Victorian Edwardian collectors, or are we going to be collecting any song that someone sings? So if you're going out into the field and you're collecting from these communities, and you're asking them to sing songs, they may start singing you a pop song, but then is that valid? Well, it could be, because if that enters into their tradition, or if they feel that that's important to them, then, and you might find that that song is still within that community's repertoire 50, 60, 70 years down the line. And then that could be important, because some people are going to be looking at that material and saying, well, this is how that song was recorded then, and you can see the developments and how that's changed over that time. So that then also implies that it's going to impact on how you collect. So are you going to be leading a conversation in a particular way? Will you be saying, oh, I've come to meet today, I'm looking for folk songs, and then they may say, well, what's that? And then you're saying, well, it's the old songs, and automatically you've already started to influence the way that they think about their own music. So again, it's how do you lead that conversation? Of course, as well, academics will be interested in like the context and background of songs, so if anyone has any history about it. So this means that you know, you got to think about actually your recording technologies, and you know, how are you going to go about recording that information? Will you be turning your tape recorder on and off at songs and turning it off between songs, or what kind of material will you be asking them for? But then also, it's interesting because from where I work, you do find that there are quite a few other people coming in to use this material. So it may not be people who are just interested in song and music, but also like social and local historians, because you know, people can start talking about their own lives and you know, describing their surroundings and their living conditions at that time. And this recording is ultimately a snapshot of what's going on within that community at that time. So all of that kind of information is still really valid. And again, that's going to be important on how you influence your conversations or how you lead them in any way. And as we said before, this information and these songs are going to be important to people within those families, you know, 50 to 100 years down the line. People from those families will want to access the material themselves, and any kind of information surrounding those songs about their grandparents who sang them before, so where that song has come from. So that's all to do with the kind of content that you could get from these recordings. But as well as the content, I as a librarian am really interested in metadata. Now, metadata isn't a word that's used that often in everyday language. So just to make it a bit clearer, these are like the labels that you put onto the content in order to make it accessible. So to help a librarian or help a user find that information. So, for example, you may go out recording and you may say to someone, oh, I'm really interested in songs, you know, can you sing me a song? And they may just start singing that. But what about the title? Does it have a title? How are we going to find it again? How are we going to locate that song again within that recording if we don't assign certain information or data to that piece of content within that recording? So things like the title and things like the performer. Now, on the handout that I've given to you, I've got an example here of the Roud Folk Song Index. And that's just kind of to give you an idea of the kind of metadata field that currently exists within one of the indexes that the English Folk Song and Dance Society's website hosts. The Roud Folk Song Index, as it explains, is an index specifically related to just song. Now, from there, you can see that all of these fields contain metadata related to just one item. So potentially, there's quite a lot of information there that you could be gathering as a collector. And the reason it's so important is because if that metadata is not taken down at the time of collection, you know, if you're going out collecting, you've made, you know, good 10, 20 hours of recording, and, you know, 6 months down the line, it's likely that you're not going to remember yourselves who you were collecting from or where exactly you were. Now, some of the frequently asked questions that I get, usually things like all content or all songs from a particular singer. So you want to be, of course, taking down the names of the singers, but if you're doing a recording session with multiple singers in the one room, you know, can you be keeping track of who's singing what, just so that it makes it accessible later, so that we can find that information later and make it actually usable. Another one which is quite interesting would be all songs from a particular location. Now, people are always interested in songs from where they came from or where they were born or brought up. But what does that mean? I mean, if you're going out collecting that song, you've gone collecting in London. So you put, oh, well, I collected this in London. But then who was that person singing it? Were they a Londoner? Do they identify as coming from that location? Because they may strongly identify with a completely different culture, or they may have been born and brought up somewhere else. And so all of that information is valid. But of course, wherever they move to, that they're going to be being influenced by their surroundings there as well. So kind of background to that song and who sang it can really help to sort of see how that song's developed and changed as well. And as I said, if that metadata is not taken down at the time of the collection, it's likely that you won't remember that in the future.
What does meta mean?
Any
idea?
Yeah, well, it's just data about data, so it's just like going down into another sub-level. So yeah, it's a funny technical term, but it just literally means data about data. Yeah. So yeah, so as I said, it's just taking the labels from that. So basically, it's hard for me to give you a complete list of everything that you need to be taking down when you go out collecting, because I'm speaking to you as if you are interested in collecting, of course. But that's just I hope that what this is doing is just highlighting the fact that this kind of information is actually really pivotal in making these recordings of any use in the future, and that hopefully it'll make you just think about your methods of recording and what kind of notes you're taking down at that time. Now, just before we move on, also I know it was brought up this morning, and it is a sticky area, but as well as making having the metadata and taking these notes down at the time of recording, of course this material can't really be of much use unless we get the permission from the people themselves. So release forms are a really important aspect of collecting, or some kind of permission from the, not the informant, what was the other term? Contributor. So yeah, so I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention again, because it's really difficult when I'm in work and someone rings up and says, I really want to use this song on the broadcast, and if we don't have that information, or if we don't have that permission there, we can't really do much with it. So, and obviously this information is there to be used, we want it to be used, so that's important. On the other side of the handout, you'll see an information flow chart. Now, when I was planning for this talk a few weeks ago, I was having a talk with Steve Roud, who is the creator of the Roud Song Index, and we got a little bit overexcited. So this is the result of that. But hopefully it would help you to sort of visualise how this information is used. And so when you go out collecting, if you've got your informant or your contributor, how that information is then going through that collection process, and before it can actually be used, it needs to go through the processing element of that. So hopefully that will give you an idea of how that flows, and the kind of content that you will be capturing, and what we need to do with that before we can disseminate it. So I'm going to hand over to Amy, who will be talking about the sort of dissemination aspects of it. You may have some questions, but maybe it's best if we hold them until everyone's done their talks at the end. Yeah? Yeah?
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I'm just going to talk you through a story, really, of the Paul Wilson collection, how we came about making it and what's happening to it now. Paul Wilson is my dad, and he made a collection on and around Dartmoor in the 70s. Which has been recently digitised. So Paul Wilson was born in Sussex in 1950 to not very well off but incredibly supportive parents, and he learned the piano from a very young age, considered giving up at the ripe old age of 10, but then overheard one of his teachers at lunchtime playing the one piece of boogie woogie piano that she knew. So he went back to see her every lunchtime and insisted that she play it to him until he'd learned it. For him, it kind of made the whole process of learning music more alive and more connected to humans than just learning classical pieces off the page. Then through a series of teenage bands, he went on to study music at Dartington College in Devon, and he found the same again, that what he was learning at college was, he felt divorced from real life and from real people and kind of their music. And he knew that you could learn music through other sources, So in the early 70s, with two of his fellow students, Sam Richards and Tish Stubbs, they became fascinated with what was going on in Devon. As seems to be the case again now, at that time folk song collecting was becoming fashionable, and the three of them set off, perhaps naively, to see what they could collect, initially as a kind of repertoire hunt for their trio Staverton Bridge. They actually began by asking Devon County Council where they could find some gypsies in Devon, and the response from Devon County was there aren't any, which of course wasn't true. So they began visiting Gypsy Traveller sites, and they found that time and again the same name, Delilah Crocker, was cropping up. She was the best singer for miles around, and they had to find her. When they did find her, they asked her for her songs, and they were literally chased off-site. She wasn't willing to sing. So this was not at all what Paul wanted or had in mind. So without his two friends, he carried on recording around Devon. Through this time going through recording, as I mentioned earlier, it's great what the kids have to bring to this whole process. So he began in playgrounds, recording clapping rhymes and skipping rhymes and nursery rhymes, and then also going to pub sessions as well. And through that he met more working people and more travellers, one of whom was a guy called Brian Holland. By this point he was realising that, like the piano, for him this had to be a kind of human process, and his words were, it's a richer process and you get a richer collection if your relationship is more than just of singer and collector. So over time Brian Holland introduced him to many other people around Devon. On one particular visit to South Seal, he went to record a squeezebox player called Albert Luxton, and in the pub that night he met Marilyn Tucker, who went on to become my mum. Well, obviously she went on to have me, not went on. And Brian also introduced him to a singer who Sam's been to collect from also, called Amy Birch, who I'm actually named after. He carried on doing this for about 10 years alongside other bits of work he was doing, and so the resultant collection was hundreds of hours of reel-to-reel recordings. And Brian and Paul are still friends today, and you remember Delilah Crocker, who chased the students off-site? That was actually Brian's granny, and so if he'd kind of waited and gone through Brian, he would have been able to record her, but unfortunately she died before he got to record her. So it's the early 80s. Marilyn is an adult education and youth worker, and Paul is a folk song collector and musician, and they saw a kind of space where their passions could meet, so they began working and living together. And in 1983 they set up the Wren Trust, which became Wren Music, and today employs 10 musicians in Devon, and through choirs, folk orchestras, youth groups, community projects and a folk festival, they have 30,000 participants every year in their projects. So it's 2008, and at Wren they've got 340 reel-to-reel tapes, a whole team of musicians who are too busy working on projects to do anything with them, and a bit of a leak in the office. So it's also worth mentioning at this point what I mentioned downstairs earlier, that Wren are the custodians of the Sabine Bearing Gold collection, which actually in the 90s Paul and Marilyn went to a National Trust property for something else that was happening there, and the librarian said, oh, you know about these notebooks, don't you? And they said, no, this is amazing, we stumbled across them. So those 600 songs and tunes then went on to microfiche. They were collected by the Reverend Sabine Bearing Gold at the end of the 19th century. So in 2009, Wren got a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund to employ project worker Melanie Smyth, who facilitated the digitisation, cataloguing and, kind of most importantly, getting the music team to understand how to engage with the collections of Bearing Gold and the Paul Wilson collection. The Bearing Gold collection is now fully available through the EFTIS website, which is eftis.org. It's a great resource, so go and have a look at it. And the Paul Wilson collection is actually we're applying the metadata, as Laura might say, which is actually quite tricky, because it would be an exaggeration to say that Dad had made copious notes as he was recording. So the metadata that the volunteers are trying to apply are who is on the recording, their name, their profession, and any relation to people who are on the recording or other people around, what they are singing or playing or talking about, if there's a title to it, the first line of it, and if it's similar, has similar themes to other pieces that crop up in other collections or within the collection, and then when and where the recording was made. In preparing for this talk, I asked around Wren why they went ahead with the digitisation process. And interestingly, everyone I asked, for none of them public access wasn't the priority. For the volunteer Jenny, who has recently retired and is now working 1 day a week on applying the metadata, she said she felt it was to preserve the physical collection itself, and to allow researchers interested in Devon life to come and find out more. For Matt, a member of the music team, he said it was going to make his job easier to be able to quickly find very local repertoire to teach to his choirs and folk orchestras around Devon. For Marilyn, my mum, she said the primary reason for digitising was to educate the staff in the origins of Wren, because Paul and Marilyn are now preparing for their retirement and it's looking like the organisation is going to carry on, so they wanted them to know where it came from. And finally, Paul came up with the most selfish reason, was the ease of navigation through his own collection, to join the dots through the metadata of where songs were similar to other things that he wasn't able to just recall from his head, and to enhance his own knowledge of Devon by being able to access it more quickly and listen to it more regularly. So we actually met up last week to talk about what we were going to talk about today, and we changed the title of the talk from referencing repatriation to referencing dissemination, and I think Paddy's going to touch on that in a minute, but I think just quickly, I think repatriation is maybe the action of physically presenting collections back to the communities that they came from. And because Wren is now embedded in these communities and still in touch with the singers and their families, there are no plans to repatriate the Paul Wilson collection in the kind of formal sense. But the plans to disseminate in Devon through the choirs, folk orchestras, youth groups, community projects and the folk festival, and further afield through national and international projects, those plans are huge. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Further on to this talk, have a look at the flow diagram here again, information flow. See, it's kind of a process that happens. It's what I've been researching lately, and it's kind of like what you could call the repatriation cycle, only it's dissemination cycle. So it's kind of repatriation and dissemination are kind of interlinked. I'll kind of talk about connections between these collections of music and connections between songs and memories and story. And I wanted to talk about tracing memory and sound, so tracing these connections and how people recall and remember all of these things as they're being recorded or as they're adding their information to something like a website or an index. Context is the circumstance in which an event occurs. Okay, we get these definitions, you find them in dictionaries online, all these different places, people coin these terms. But a broader and more elaborate description exists, but for my purposes, I would like to position the word within itself and tell a story that will evoke stronger feelings and memories in this room today. Okay. So you can often find that these coined terms have no relation to what actually happens in the real world, i.e. going out and collecting. Story I have in mind brings me back to a time when I remember I was about 5 years old growing up in Wicklow. In the homestead was my grandfather talking to two friends who used to stop by to share the news of the day, have a chat with no worry about the passing of time, have a few drinks in the home place. Sitting in the living room and talking about various topics for hours on end, they would soon be involved with trading knowledge about families in the immediate area. This would involve starting out with neighbours down the road, who's related to who, where they came from, how they were doing, stories that had been connected to them, the conversation shifting from one family to the next, like stepping stones across a river. So You've often seen that, I'd say, in your own family life, where you'll hear someone talking to the older generation, particularly where they'll start talking about friends and relations and relatives moving on out from the point where you're actually sitting all the way out 50 miles down the road. Until the stories faded and each new story's details become less easy to remember as they reach families and locations really far away. This, in essence, was an exercise in tracing memory for these people, making connections between separate pieces of information gathered over time, sometimes to reaffirm their ideology in life or to use story to link the realities of what existed in their immediate surroundings. It was most often an important part of a lengthy conversation in rural Ireland in the not-so-distant past. So we don't really see it as much these days, but it was more important to the cultural values of people who have gone before. For the purposes of my talk, I'll reflect on the idea of connection sharing, tracing memory, emphasising its importance in building context around fieldwork recordings. The topics will uncover methods which enable us to share this tracing or context building in the digital age. We'll cover two aspects to further this discussion. A, building context offline through the return or what is called the repatriation of sound objects. Firstly, a look at repatriation and what it means, and then B, the dissemination of content online. So when I first heard about this, the Song Collectors Collective, they informed me that this was about collecting music from the communities and putting it online. So I didn't hear very much about what was happening outside of that until I went to the first meeting. Okay, so repatriation, what does it mean? Everyone has their own idea of what it means. I suppose it's mostly linked to cultural groups and cultural objects rather than sound. Mostly started off with people returning to their country of origin. An academic has coined it as any conveyance of copies of sound recordings made and deposited as scholarly documents from archives to people who feel that the sound is part of their heritage. Song Collectors Collective is not as much interested in this academic view of it. Okay? So what they're doing is about people sharing ideas with other people, sharing their history, sharing their memories and their connections. This academic suggests here that the recordings are in the hands of collectors, those who are not part of the same community that they studied. They're extracting material from that culture, being separated from the original place of recording and then returning it to that specific community. So it's kind of like fishing where they catch and release. They take the fish from the stream that flows and then you release it back into the stream. Memory and metadata has a lot to say about this area. Okay, so memory and metadata in the processing step of the information flow. Look at the diagram. On the very bottom it says processing. It says storage of originals, backups, future proofing, organizing, cataloging, indexing, and mediation. The mediation between who? The mediation between the collector and the collected, the indexer, the archivist, all these different people who need to communicate between each other in order for this to move on to the next process, which is the dissemination. Metadata standards is a well-known process to archivists which categorizes and describes the details surrounding song or tune, sets up the material so that it may be easily retrieved. The archivist, collector, or intended end user can then use a consistent framework to access this material. However, as the flow continues and the music is eventually repatriated or disseminated, further context or tracing can be built up around the material, which adds more connection to the sound objects in question. When recordings are physically taken from the archive and given back, they are presented to the community with the intention of reinforcing connections to support tracing in that culture. So we're taking things like CDs, recording CDs, burning them off, bringing them back to the community and saying, here's the music that we recorded of you, now what? Okay, so you can imagine yourself, if I was to record someone singing or playing music here today, and I was to go away for the weekend, come back and say, here's your CD, you'd probably look at me and go, well, what's the use of that? Okay, so it's essential that timing is correct. So what can people gain from the return or repatriation of this music in a community as opposed to providing access to them online or in the institution? So there's two different things. Again, the dissemination or the repatriation of collections. Okay? Two of the goals in the Song Collectors Collective are both disseminating music online and giving it back to the community through physical repatriation. Repatriation has been taking place with sound recordings for decades. Some have been quite successful in supporting and reaffirming cultural identity, creative expression and community development. One such project highlights how connections of memory are linked through this process. This is a study in Northeast Arnhem Land, Australia in 2003. So there was an ethnomusicologist, his name was Peter Toner. He was put in place to bring music back from the archive and give it back to the people who it wants being recorded. This happened the recordings happened between the 1920s and the 1980s. So it had been about 3 decades since they had heard the original recordings. Some of the contributors had been still alive and they were listening back to their own recordings again. So this is not something that was repatriation of material that is separated from the original community. It's actually some of the original community are still there. Next page. Toner here describes responses that provide valuable insight into how repatriation can evoke thoughts and feelings among members of the community, shape the recordings into more valuable material. Okay. As you can imagine, feelings were witnessed were thoughts regarding change, continuity in musical style, like comparing old and modern performances, movement with the music through dancing, laughter, tears, and memories around kinship. He brings to our attention other feelings that were brought up, such as memories about the singers, memories about the people who produced recordings, the sessions themselves during recording, and general thoughts about the musical past. So this is metadata about metadata. Okay? Toner's study involved a repatriation process that took recordings that had been in an archive for decades, dusted off the shelves, and physically transported back to a community where it was once recorded. In some cases, memory and recall had survived well in the minds of listeners since that record button had brought an end to the experience of culture at that time in history, not very long before. For us, reaching back from memory or tracing in the mind pulls parts of a story together to recall to create the event once again. How we access this memory depends on recall sensations until we build up a picture of how the event occurred. So you remember the last musical event you went to, and what were the sensations that came up in your memory of that time? What was happening in the room for you? What's most important for you? Depends on how long ago that was. How long ago was the last musical event you went to or song you listened to? Timing the return is very important, as I said before. When addressing metadata, institutions are increasingly adopting frameworks to reflect these cultural values of different communities. Just like good knowledge of language is required for good translation, good knowledge of cultural values should be present in the creation of accurate context around the recordings of material. Incomplete documentation from the start of the fieldwork collection, right here from the end user informant of the information flow into the collection. This can be problematic not only for indexing, but for an outsider's correct understanding of a culture and the message that is being conveyed. So you can imagine someone taking something from the traveller community and bringing it to the collection with no context, and it being disseminated with no context around it. People don't understand what is all this about, and they'll take up different ideas about it, and then it'll be presented in an incorrect way. Difference here with the Song Collectors Collective in repatriation is that when they bring music back to the community, it will be not decades after it was recorded. They will have the people from that community still there, still alive, and not translocated, hopefully, if they're not traveling. With this, they can avoid the intentions of people where collectors have ideas on it, and their intentions will not be reflected in it. It will be the intentions of the end user, the contributor, or the informant. So consequently then, when repatriating these objects to communities and collect more context, we increase the value of the materials for the local community and also for the archive. That's repatriation. A look now towards the website on the dissemination section again. The website idea. So what are these digital tools, and how can we use these digital tools online? How can these be shared by members of the community? How can the collector, archivist, scholar, field worker, people in the actual traveller community, how can they all share all these ideas? As described earlier in the panel, dissemination refers to a kind of presentation of material that can happen in a number of ways. One of them is to broadcast information online. to a number of communities who might connect to retrieve the information concerned. So online dissemination is a lot different in that you're sending it out to communities all over instead of one specific community that deals with repatriation. Okay? Repatriation deals with just one community on its own mostly. During the information flow which takes place, websites serving digital material are not only digital archives, but also act as reference points, adding a sense of broadcasting as it's shared with more than one geographic location. Today, dissemination of mass amounts of data online broadcasts to multiple audiences, sometimes where the information is intended to reach them or not, is happening everywhere. It's happening the world over. Everyone has seen examples of this. You'll find recordings of people in weirdest of places on the weirdest of websites. Okay, all different types of websites set up for different reasons by different people, different organizations. Connecting to others online, referencing sources, linking between pages and sites, all serve to promote the very foundation of what the internet was based upon, and that is of open access, so sharing of information. If it's carefully managed, media can be extremely useful to both performers within their community, enthusiasts, the public, and the scholar. As collections online continue to grow with greater available storage space, memory and metadata about metadata can provide strong links between people in various cultural groups. So I'm just going to show you one example of how this can be successful. Dissection.org is a website that can be found on allthews.dissection.org. It provides musicians with the ability to document the music that they play in informal gatherings of music jams throughout the world, namely the Irish Music Session. It's an example of how cultural materials such as tunes and songs can be presented and shared among public people online for the greater good without controlling impact of copyright or restricted access to interact. The session started over a decade ago as a non-profit resource where Irish traditional music could be shared between musicians who attend informal pub sessions throughout the world. There has been invaluable service to performers since its inception. Documentation occurs in many ways. A. Commercial recordings and variants in tune names are displayed. ABC and staff notation. And C. Comments and differing versions of mostly traditional Irish music may be submitted by users and shared freely amongst the online community and made accessible to the world. So anyone can send up their ideas, their transcriptions, their comments, or anything what they think about a certain piece of music without it being banned or without it even being seen or to be regulated. As a free guest user, when you search for a tune and click on the results, you are presented with all the previously submitted information about this tune from members of the online community. Very often in the comments section, there are other versions of the tune transcribed, sometimes up to 4 or 5 versions at a time. In this musical tradition, there's very often multiple names for tunes that are presented. I've come across tunes with 10 names or 12 names over the years. They're very old tunes. A lot of them are 150 to 200 years old. So the user can see different noted names from various sources of that same tune, and they can link up these connections. They can link up ideas and connections between different tunes. There's no great skill needed to submit content, therefore it's user-friendly for all who might need to add a tune to the resource. The user base of those who are not necessarily computer programmers or authoritative academics, but just performers of the music who want to share their experiences with others. With models of user-driven websites such as Dissection, the quality of content can either be sometimes misleading in that users may not always have an attention to detail. Bad transcription, poor documentation of recordings leave the end user with incorrect information, which can be noticeable by others, especially when they play the tune wrong in a session performance. However, the session can be an invaluable tool aiding one to learn music in the tradition when used wisely. Only have to hear the name of a tune, check it out as a reference on the website to learn the bones or the gist of the new piece, and then finish the learning while listening to commercial recordings by seasoned musicians or going out and inquiring about it at a session. In a similar fashion, bones of a tune is learnt in a session by playing quietly and worked on until the piece has been completely picked up and improved on, then shared with the next learner. So the actual process of learning tunes in the oral tradition is very similar to what happens on thesession.org, only it's in textual form. Similarly, notating songs, sharing knowledge online can serve to foster a continuation of exchange, of adding meaning and joining connections between sound objects. Projects such as the Song Collectors Collective now have the opportunity to continue the interest in collecting, to add value to what's been indexed, to return valuable memories that can be connected, traced and shared by communities. As the digital age gives us opportunities and tools to achieve this, the work we do in supporting culture has the potential to share these tools and memories for years to come.
I think that was interesting because it kind of highlighted as well that, and a point that I want to bring out is that this collecting, I mean, we're doing this as a Song Collectors Collective, but really any work that you do is bigger than that. It should go beyond the Song Collectors Collective, because the Song Collectors Collective may not exist in 10 years' time, but that content that you create or that you find is valuable forever. So I think that was kind of, I don't know, came out a bit from that. But I don't know, how are you doing?
I think we've probably got, what do you think?
We've
got 2 minutes till the official we started 15 minutes late. So
yeah. Any questions?
Questions?
Hello.
Can I ask one question straight off?
Go on.
Is there going to be a resource? Song Collectors Collective, that has a website now,
No.
It's on the way. The website is on the way, yeah.
Can we have a list of all these other websites which are resources?
Yeah.
Definitely.
No, it would be really handy to see. I mean,
it's going to take a while to build a website.
yeah.
I have one myself, one I made earlier. This is my website, Outreach at the Musicology. If anyone is interested, just pass it along, just pick up a flyer.
I'd just like to add,
I can send you a list of all of those if you'd like to send a message on there.
You've got to make this very good thing.
Excellent.
Can I just add something to what Paddy was saying, and then you take those 2 questions? Just the idea of repatriation and returning things to communities once they've been divorced for a little while, and how you mentioned the Song Collectors Collective. It's going to be a very different kettle of fish because it's now, and when you take it back, that person who sang it to you yesterday is still going to be there. And the way that Paul and Ren have approached this is to actually, when there's somebody who in the 70s he would have collected from, they now take the approach of working with them to put together an album which is kind of released under their total artistic control. So I've got an example if anybody wants to have a look. A guy called Malcolm Woods, who's a box player from Essex. You might know him, I think he played for Angel Morris for a number of years. And so they've worked with him to make an album that he's totally in control of. So it's kind of repatriation, but kind of dissemination and kind of commercialisation, I don't know. It's just interesting. I had one question here and one question over here.
I just wanted to quickly, briefly mention the website where the Berengold, I wonder whether you could give us the address of that, didn't you?
Oh yeah, so originally...
where will your...
so there's a Ren Music website, which is renmusic.co.uk. There's actually some leaflets about Ren at the back. Originally it was through a website called the Devon Tradition, and if you Google Devon Tradition that comes up. But now the collection is hosted by EFTIS along with
6 other collections, manuscript collections from Victorian Edwardian and later collectors as well. And that's, so if you go through www.efdss.org, and then then you have to go through the library section of that website. So you should find on there that it says digital archives, and you should be able to access that. But yeah, I mean, I think as the gentleman at the back was saying, you know, it'd be good to sort of look at some of these websites, and even just to try exploring some of their search tools, to have a play around with these online collections, just to see how this information is presented, and how you can search for that information, because it might sort of help you to sort of realise how this information is organised.
To add to that point, the British Library Oral History Archive.
Oh yeah, and that's fabulous. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, as many websites as you can find online.
They've just relaunched, British Library's relaunched the sounds.bl.uk now.
Yeah.
Look quite a lot at that collection, but that's really good. You can sort of, I like how they've done that. There's different sort of ways of exploring that website that I recommend revisiting if you know it from the past. It's more user friendly now.
Right.
I'm going to be working with a group of people from different cultures, and in the absence of myself understanding the context of all the different cultures, would you advise having an ethnomusicologist present, or can they listen to it afterwards to help me contextualise it?
It depends on the type of situation you're in. A lot of the time, ethnomusicologists wouldn't understand these things. Yeah.
I mean, do you think the person themselves can help? Can give you context?
One of the things about the good things with the Song Collectors Collective is that it's building relationships and keeping that relationship going that was formed in the field. Going back to those people instead of this diagram is a simplification of well, it's not a bare simplification, but it's detailed enough that it gives you a good idea. But what should happen in the processing point is that very often you will be going back to the end user again and sharing those connections and building up the ideas around what the intentions are and how it should be properly done. But only the person who has collected from them and you know should be sharing this with the informant and the archivist and everyone that's involved. So as much connection between everyone as possible is very important.
Yeah, but I think that kind of relates back to my talk earlier, which was that sometimes it's just not possible. You can't do that. I mean, especially if you're dealing with collections that were made, you know, 50 years ago or even older, and which again is part of the reason why the collector, actually the information that they collect, not just the content, is actually so vital in order to help those people processing that information to actually make it of any use to anyone, because that context needs to be there surrounding that information. So
that's where the Song Collectors Collective differs a lot from I suppose the ethics around this as well.
Sure.
Where it's actually avoiding a lot of problems by bringing it back to people as they're still there.
yeah, I mean, it's obviously we've been, because we have, well, collection has been going on now for over 100 years. You can learn from the mistakes of past collectors. You can see where, oh, I wish that they took that down at that time, or, you know, why is their handwriting so terrible? You know, it's that kind of thing. And, you know, so, yeah, now that hopefully we've got these examples from the past to work on, that should hopefully improve in the future. So.
I also like the idea of it being a human process, and how in terms of ownership, actually asking the people you're collecting from what they think about it is maybe more kind of valid than asking what someone who studied it thinks about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many digital technologies now where if this does go out on a website, dependent upon whether those people are techno-friendly or whatever, you know, if they understand computers, they may be accessing this information online, and they may be able to add that context themselves. So if that is then presented to them through an online website with some kind of data capturing facilities there, then they could say, oh, I also remembered that this bit of information about it, and build that context onto it after it's been made or presented back to them. So that's why in the diagram it is a flow, because the end user could end up becoming the informant again, and that process is started all over again.
I have a question here. I've been waiting.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I saw
Go
this
on.
one.
Right. So I had another question, but just to respond to that, the idea of kind of accuracy of metadata and collecting, because I've been in situations where you're collecting from somebody and they tell you a story that is wildly at odds with what everybody else tells you about the root of that tradition or of that song. And actually, as you have, this maybe is where the ethnomusicologist comes in, not as the root of all knowledge, but as another perspective, or just the study of that tradition. And just wondering, you know, where validity of contextual information, how you work with that in an archive and creating a context.
Well, I think that if you go and collect from someone and they say, oh, well, I learned this from, or they come up with a story, that's kind of interesting in itself. I mean, that content there that they provide still helps to put it into a context and still helps to, it could be interesting for future, for people who want to use this information, because, well, why did he come up with this story? What was that about? But then I think with that situation, if you do have other people then giving you their own perspectives on that, then all content is valid. But
is there a way of kind of stratifying? Yes, I'm not trying to kind of negate the validity of any content, because actually the person you're recording off, the fact that they believe this song is from so exactly. Is almost the most real, and talking about how traditions change. But equally at the same point, in trying to keep tabs on where things come from and how things develop, do you stratify different levels of metadata, as it were, or of contextual information?
That's something that will be worked out along the way, and I totally believe in taking everything, and every piece of metadata, every piece of information is important. On the Song Collector's website or Facebook page, you'll see actually there's a picture there, and there's an ethnomusicologist, and it looks like she's recording or something, or taking something from this Indian chief in America, but it's actually wrong on Wikipedia, so they explained it wrong completely. And when you look at that piece, you can say, oh, you have to correct that and make it right. But if you correct that and make it right, then you're losing a piece of information that someone's thoughts straight away. When you see the picture, you think it's one thing, but it's actually another. So it shows people's ideas about these things, So every piece of metadata and information is important.
I've just noticed the time. Could we just have Laura's comment and then those two questions, and then maybe call it a day?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think probably the best way to deal with that kind of a problem is by linking. If you do have multiple sources of information regarding the same thing, is to somehow link that. I mean, I'm going to go back to the Roud Index example here. I mean, one of the things that Steve actually did with his index was he actually created what we call the Roud numbers. So this is basically a number that he's assigned to a particular song. Now he's based that purely on the subject or the content of the song. And then what he does is whenever he indexes a song from a different book or a different sound recording, if he recognises that song to be of a similar content, then he will assign the same number, so that when you search for that number, you get all the different variations of that same song coming up in one search. So that can be really useful, because then you can actually compare those variations, see how they might have a completely different title, and one song may talk about a sailor, but the next one's about a cowboy. But yet it's essentially, it could actually be.
Do all those connections, you actually get the reality of the context.
Yeah, because you see, and even that then it can show you, so you can say, okay, well this song was about a sailor, and this was collected, say, in 1905, and then again it was collected in 1920, and now it's about a cowboy, and that those kind of developments of that song and how they've all been linked together, this can be really fascinating.
I think there's a good link actually to our website. If you go on to Google and you type in iBiblio, I-B-I-B-L-I-O, and right after that word type in Kesh Jig, so one of the Botty Band's tunes, and you come onto this website, which is basically, it's got a list of all of the different music from books, collections of music and song around the British Isles and America for the last 200 years. And basically, you spend hours on this if you're interested in this thing. You click on one link and it brings you to another page, and then it brings you to another song, and then it just keeps linking all the way. So you spend hours and hours just looking at it. And I think that's it's an amazing thing, because there's all stories about the songs and tunes, and there's different annotations and the recording. So it's a bit different to the session, where it's not user submitted content, but it's authoritative kind of added in content.
I'd maybe just like to add to that also. The whole thing about the folk process, it's kind of something I think about quite a lot, how we kind of have to let go of that classical music idea that the original is the true one, and that actually all those different variations and all the way they interact is all part of actually the true version of the song, taking it from wherever you want. I have a question here.
Yeah. Just a practical thing, really. I've got a whole series of interviews with musicians, because I do a bit of journalism, on old-fashioned tapes, because I just for Christmas got an electronic dictaphone and hit behind. And I was thinking it'd be fascinating to kind of get them on SoundCloud or something with the permission. But just in terms of practicalities, do you guys have experience of actually getting from tape to electronic format and cleaning up the recordings? I've got a great one from Vietnam, but it's really hard to hear. So just what you found like?
We were lucky enough to get a grant to pay someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, do that. I think that seems to be the usual case. Like, for example, with some of our collections, we at our library a number of years ago, they found boxes of wax cylinders, which we couldn't use and we can't play, but we really wanted that content. We actually donated them to the British Library on the condition that they digitised them and presented that back to us. So, I mean, there's always those kind of options if you do go to a proper institution like that.
Have they done it?
Yes, and they are all available on the British Library, the Sound Archive, and so you can actually search those now. So it's really good content. Yeah.
One last question here, then we're going to have to.
Actually, I was just going to respond to your question about collecting songs from people from other places, other countries. What you basically need is a translator. I mean, that's what you really have to have, isn't it? If you're going to get the information from the singer, you need somebody who speaks the language.
Great. Thanks very much for coming and listening.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I've been told by Sam to let everyone know that the next